Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. The podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. Now, since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the world feels more and more insecure. And this sense of insecurity is especially present in places we used to feel secure, college campuses, public rallies, and so forth. How did we get here? And perhaps just as important, how do we get out of this place of insecurity? To answer these and other questions, I am so glad to welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast, Elizabeth Neumann. Elizabeth served as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security during the Bush administration, came back to the White House again in 2017 to serve in the Trump administration, the first one, publicly resigning in 2020. She is the author of Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. Elizabeth, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Curtis.
Elizabeth, so let's get right into it. As an expert on security, on national security, what was your initial reaction to the news of the assassination of Charlie Kirk?
I was at a terrorism and political violence conference.
Jeez.
Right next door to Ground Zero in New York City. And we were convened there to talk about the state of terrorism and political violence. And I was about to go on stage as news was breaking and was comparing notes with a few of the colleagues that I was going to share the panel stage with. And I mean, of course, there's the heartbreak for his family. And at the time, we didn't know if he had passed, but it didn't look good from what we could see. And then there's the heartbreak for the community that experiences that violence, the college campus that it was on, the people that were in the crowd, but also it just shatters your sense of safety. And so every community that goes through this, there's just a fracturing that occurs that you feel that pain. And so there's the tragedy of the moment, but there also, as professionals, we were looking at each other going, oh, this is going to get really bad. It was this terrible sinking feeling that this might be the moment that we watch our country cross the abyss. And I still fear that is maybe, I think we can work to avoid crossing the abyss, but it does feel like we are in a very fragile moment right now.
So describe that fragile moment. What is fragile? What is the threat that really we have to take very seriously could happen here?
I think it's important to put this into context. We are in the 11th year of increasing plots and attacks of targeted violence. 11 years that it has been spiking. There are a few dips in a few years, but just generally, if you take the trend line, it's way more than it was in 2015. And if you look at the previous 25 years before that, it's not like we've been on this uptick in perpetuity. It's that around the 2015, something in our society effectively broke, and we just have started to see more and more of these types of attacks, and they vary. There's school shootings, there attacks in shopping malls, there's attacks at music concerts, and then in the more recent years, we've seen more assassination attempts, and those go back really in the first instance that I would say in the modern era is that 2011 attack on Congresswoman Giffords. But so we have had a steady increase of those as well, but quite a lot in the last 2 to 3 years. Definitely the kind of thing that in my field raises eyebrows. This is a tactic shift. It used to be that we saw attackers focusing on, for lack of a better word, body count. And that is how they think about it, is how many people can I kill, because that makes me seem special in the communities that I was participating in online. Now it's less maybe about how many people can I kill, but can I kill somebody of notoriety? Can I get fame from that? And so the tactics might be shifting, but the fact that we are seeing increasing levels of violence is not new. And that is rather alarming because as a security professional, I have like good news. We actually can prevent this. We know a whole lot about why people go and commit these attacks. And we've been trying to raise awareness across the communities, across the country, that we can prevent the level of violence that we encounter. But it is really hard to get people to pay attention. There are government solutions, but there's also community solutions. And so there's one part of me that looks at a moment like this and says, hey, is this a moment that we are shaken awake and we say, enough, I don't want to live this way anymore? I mean, every time my kids go back to school, I'm getting the message about how we're going to do the school shooter drills and having those conversations with the kids. There was a school shooting at the end of August that we've all kind of already forgotten about in Minnesota at a Catholic school. There was a school shooting the day of Charlie Kirk's assassination, not more than a few miles from where my children go to school. I mean, this is very real for families across this country. And we have decided that there's nothing we can do about it. And there's part of me that wants to be hopeful that by having a very large on-scale conversation as a nation, that maybe we could say, I don't want to live this way anymore. Let's do something about this and start talking practically about what we could do to reduce violence. However, I am also seeing the voices of anger and outrage continue to deepen the things that actually got us into this mess in the first place. And so that's why I'm nervous. Are we crossing the abyss? Are we getting to the place where we can't bring healing? We can't fix this. We're just going to launch a new wave of even more escalating violence. I don't think that has to be our story, but I am very nervous about the moment we find ourselves in.
Elizabeth, you talk about kind of the need for a national conversation. So it strikes me in hearing your comments that it's important to clarify the terms and scope and topics of the conversation. And by that, I mean, it sounds like you're locating like the shooting of Charlie Kirk in the larger landscape of violence that includes something like school shooting. Whereas I think a lot of the dialogue is very more narrowly focused in the politics of the situation. So say more about that. Why are you locating this in a broader conversation versus a narrowly political conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Curtis. There is no doubt that there is more political violence, and that term has to do with violence framed around either a party or an elected official from the opposing view. There is more political violence in the last few years than we have encountered really since the 1960s. And that is very alarming. But I do think, and many people in my field think, that there's a broader context that we can look at through the lens of, which is that of the behavior of the individual that goes and carries out these attacks is very, very similar regardless of what the motivation is. So if we're talking about a premeditated act of violence, so not somebody that's reacting in a moment, but somebody has fixated on a target and planned and goes and carries out that attack, whether that person's doing it because they're inspired by a great replacement theory, they're anti-Semitic, they don't like a certain political candidate or elected official, the behaviors that they exhibit in the lead up to carrying out that attack are very, very similar. And because they're very, very similar, it actually makes it really easy. Easy might be too simple of a word, but it makes it detectable and preventable, because we're not assessing somebody's beliefs. We're not assessing somebody's First Amendment speech, protected speech. What we're assessing are behaviors of concern that have been associated in the past with people that have carried out attacks. Some of the examples of behaviors might be that they get isolated really quickly, they withdraw. If you hear somebody speaking specifically about either they themselves don't see a point to life. In fact, a lot of the attackers in the past 2 to 3 years are people that are engaging in what we would consider nihilism, so much so that the FBI has created a new category of extremism called nihilist violent extremism. And that is really a reflection of, as we dig into an attacker's manifesto or their postings online or their conversations with other bystanders, you come to realize that they might put a veneer on of like, I'm a white supremacist, or I'm a put some other category on it. But actually, when you dig in, it is not actually a deeply held ideology as much as they don't see a point to life. And this is very different, Curtis, from the terrorists that we were dealing with in Al-Qaeda. If you take a kind of multi-decade view in the 1990s and the 2000s, whether we're looking at domestic terrorist groups or international terrorist groups, these are groups that had pretty well-formed ideologies, lots of text, lots of training. When somebody joined their group, they were indoctrinated into what it means to believe what we believe. And that mattered in those group formations. And it led to people that committed attacks with a very strong tie to the ideology. The ideology was a strong motivation and gave a justification for why violence was necessary. We don't have that anymore. It's almost like we've shifted, and we watched this happen with the change of the internet. We shifted from text-based to video-based, but still an indoctrination process, to now it's short posts, think tweets, to memes. We are seeing people radicalize based on memes. And some of these memes don't make any sense, which is why if you looked at some of the analysis coming out of the shooter in Minnesota, like his manifesto, and my team at the company I work for reviewed it all. A lot of it doesn't make sense. The individual that is accused of having killed Mr. Kirk wrote some funny things on the bullets, and it is a reflection of his gaming culture. That is more and more common, that it isn't necessarily, there's not a logic. There's not necessarily an A plus B equals C. It's just a reflection of the broader culture as a whole, that we don't adhere deeply to things anymore. It's very surfacey. And yet the underlying needs that drive these attackers are pretty similar across the years. It is a need for purpose, a need for belonging, and often combined with some sort of life crisis that has happened in a fairly recent period of time. So usually in most attackers, you see some sort of life crisis in the previous 6 to 12 months. That life crisis might be they got kicked out of school or lost a job, loss of a loved one or some sort of relationship, and humiliation, a humiliation that could be specific to the individual, or it could be broader to a group that person identifies with. So particularly when you look at terrorist groups from long ago, it was often group humiliation that mobilized people to seek the experience of being in a terrorist group and finding that belonging and take, if you will, taking their power back, taking agency by being in this terrorist group, and we're going to show you humiliated us, we're going to take revenge. So when I come back to your question of like, what are you looking for in an individual that might be exhibiting behaviors of concern? And I will share with you, Curtis, so you can put it in show notes. There are websites that list a number of these behaviors. It is, what you're looking for is somebody who you might be concerned about a suicide risk. Just because you're suicidal does not mean you're going to be committing a mass attack. But most people who commit mass attacks are suicidal as well. So you might be seeing somebody who's indicating that they're just going to give up on it all. They might have a fixation with a particular person or a particular group of people that they think don't deserve to be here. And they often use language like they just need to go away. And again, I'm speaking the way Gen Xer speaks. When an attacker is Gen Z, they're going to talk the way Gen Z speaks. And so it might look different depending on the generation, how they're talking about things. But you're looking for that withdrawing behavior, possibly some sort of life crisis that they haven't been able to deal with effectively. And generally speaking, younger attackers leak their information. Older attackers tend to leak less. But that leaking might actually be a talking about their plans. And often what a bystander will say is like, I didn't think they were serious. And so those are the moments that we're trying to educate the public. If somebody says something, take them seriously. It's go call it depends on the state that you live in, but some states have set up systems where you can actually connect to a mental health professional, and they have been trained and can help you as a bystander figure out the right way to address the concern. And they are better trained to be able to assess a particular instance and know whether you need to call law enforcement. In other states, they don't have that system set up. And so your primary call is going to be to law enforcement. Most states are setting up threat assessment capability. And so they know how to conduct that threat assessment and make a decision whether somebody is at risk to themselves or the public. But those systems are more mature in some places than others. And that kind of goes back to what I was sharing earlier, that we actually do know how to solve this, but we're not investing in it and maturing it as fast as we need to be able to reduce the amount of violence we're seeing in the country.
I think it's really interesting that, the threat now is not ideologically driven, but really by a sense of shame, lack of purpose, lack of meaning, a sense of crisis in their life. So you make that list, like, gosh, you want, like, what would be a community or, sort of influence institution that addresses and helps people in shame, crisis, purpose, meaning. And the answer, if you're a Christian or even if you're a sociologist, is that sounds like you're talking about the church. And yet, when I think about that, I have to confess, I'm a little pessimistic about that, mainly because I think there's a parallel crisis in the church right now of their ability to reach precisely this generation. You see in many churches, it's like their youth ministry is the very young, and then once you get into high school, it just hollows out. And so I don't think, as a generalization, our churches are doing a very good job at reaching that. What's your assessment of the role of churches in this kind of monitoring, alerting, spotting, and hopefully healing these underlying conditions?
I absolutely agree that we, the church, should be the answer. We have very sophisticated and deep answers for the question of, does life have meaning? Yeah. And not in a way that maybe the world might offer. I actually think some of the collision course that we're on, because it's, mass violence is horrific. It's one negative outcome that we're experiencing as a broader society. Like, we have high levels of depression, anxiety, and
loneliness. Yeah.
Loneliness. Yes.
Yeah.
We are not well as a society.
Yeah.
And for some, their way out of that not well is by committing these attacks. So when you start working upstream, what you end up doing is you're addressing all of those ills, all of those harms, and we kind of need to have a broader conversation. I think the church is well equipped to have this broader conversation as a society to say, like, why are there so many people that are dissatisfied with life? Why, in particular, I know we're having conversations about men, both the secular community and the church, lots of conversations around, our boys aren't doing okay, men aren't doing okay. Why is that? And I think some of it is for, I don't know, our entire lives, we've been going along and bought into this American dream that my life is going to be better than my parents' life. And you know what? That has not panned out the last 2 decades. We had multiple financial crises. We had COVID. We have now social media telling us all of the ways in which we are not measuring up. Look how good this influencer has it. Look how good my buddy seems to have it together, and I don't. And so there's this collision course that the American dream has failed a generation. And there are a lot of people rightly asking, have I been lied to my whole life? You told me if I worked really hard and if I, got into the right school, that I would have meaning in my life. And it's not working out for me. And
Yeah.
the things that I'm raising, these are not things that a counterterrorism person is able to speak into, but certainly community leaders and youth leaders and the church does have important contributions to make to say, you're right, there is something bigger and more important than pursuing the American dream. And let's talk about what it looks like to serve others. Let's talk about what it looks like to find a life of meaning. And that I think is the very deep, long-term solution we need to have a conversation about, in addition with the government roles of having these intervention capabilities for those that are on that pathway to violence.
Yeah, I think it's a clarion call for the church to invest more deeply in trying to figure out how do you reach this particular generation. Unfortunately, the church business model does not prioritize youth ministers. Youth ministers are kind of low person on the totem pole. But in terms of contributing to a society-wide need and a response, I think I find it hard to prioritize any part of the ministry other than youth ministry right now. Elizabeth, one of the aspects of youth ministry that I got to confess as a 50-year-old something that I just don't understand is the gaming culture, which seems to really be propagating a lot of these shooters. And I obviously saw that some memes being etched on Kirk's assassins' shell casings. Help us understand. I don't know how much you've sort of studied and monitored what is happening in these online gaming communities, but why is this such a breeding ground seemingly for these shooters?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of important caveats. There is no demonstrated evidence that if you game, you're more likely to be violent. That said, I think there has been some new research that demonstrates that if you are very online, meaning you're spending most of your waking hours in online communities, not because you're going to work and you're having to do Zoom calls, but because you aren't going to work, you are instead spending all your time engaging in something online that usually for men and boys, it's games. That pattern of behavior is very unhealthy. So it's not necessarily the gaming as much as the amount of time you're spending online that is keeping you disconnected from that embodied connection with human beings. So that's one piece that the evidence is starting to show. Very online leads to negative outcomes on a whole host of mental health and possibly having an association with higher violence risk. There's also a second piece to gaming that I feel like we've started to see some mainstream conversations about, but I would love to kind of alert parents to. And that's the fact that extremists and other bad actors use gaming platforms to recruit. And so your kid might not be on games, 24/7. Good for you for setting boundaries, but they might end up in conversation with somebody that is then inviting them to a private chat that's then inviting them to down a rabbit hole of some sort of radicalization process. So those are the two places that I am most concerned about when it comes to gaming. Is it interfering with our ability to connect with human beings in real life, in school, in at work, or going out and meeting people in real life because I've got to play my game, or is that a place where they're being exposed to content, not necessarily the game itself, but in the chats? There is a network called the Com Network. It's also known as 764. That there've been a number of arrests in recent months. It's been around for about 2 years and starting to gain some prominence. They do a lot of recruiting online, and they use manipulation tactics to basically extort kids to get to a place where then the kids themselves are extorting the next group of kids to participate, and we've seen people end up killed through this network, and they are primarily recruiting in online gaming platforms. So it is a very real thing to be aware of. I can't say that that's the situation of the shooter, of the alleged shooter of Mr. Kirk. There's still a lot that we don't know about his activities online. He definitely did seem to have some sort of nexus to gaming. Initially, from what I can tell, my concern would be maybe more in that first category of he's probably spent a lot of time alone and didn't have a lot of connection with a larger group of people.
Boy, it sounds like you're issuing another clarion call in addition to churches, but it's to parents. It's to not sort of abdicate their role of knowing what their kids are doing, especially behind closed doors. But it's critical because that's their formation process. Elizabeth, you have talked about the need for us to have a national conversation about violence in general. If you're talking about a national conversation, just a key participant in that is the president, and then the administration that he leads. How would you evaluate how the Trump administration is responding to our crisis and violence?
I am discouraged. There was a unique opportunity in such a tragedy to bring people together. And most of the administration's actions are feeding that us-them context, which is the precursor to extremism. The definition I use comes from a scholar named J.M. Berger, that extremism is when a person in a group feels that another group poses such a threat to your success or survival, so success and survival, either of those, that the only thing that you can do is commit an act of hostile action. It's not about voting. It's not about persuasion. It's not about, having a healthy debate. It's no, hostile action is necessary. And hostile action is on a spectrum. It includes things like bullying, harassment, and intimidation. So in some cases, non-criminal acts. So these are not things that law enforcement can show up at your door, but they are things that in a school context, we do tell kids, no, you can't bully, no, you can't harass. That's bad. Why is it bad? We're not telling them don't bully somebody because you might get arrested. We're telling them not to bully somebody because that's not the human beings that we want to form. We want our children to grow up and contribute to a good, healthy society. And raising a bunch of bullies is not the way to do it. And, oh, by the way, it creates tremendous harm on the victim, right? So there's this aspect of extremism that we don't talk about a lot because we are mostly focused on when it gets into that criminal space of a hate crime, which might be vandalism or actual threats of violence, which can be criminal, to actual crimes of violence like murder or terrorism, all the way up to genocide. That's the spectrum. And what I have been arguing is that if you want to reduce the amount of violence, the criminal acts, you actually need to reduce the other end of the spectrum because it is a funnel. And you have a lot more people participating on that lower end of the spectrum, and very, very few that are going to ever progress to something criminal. But the more people you have operating on that lower end of the spectrum, the more you're going to have acts of violence. So if you want to reduce the amount of violence, you got to reduce the amount of people operating in that lower end of the extremism spectrum. And my concern is that as a country, we have gotten very comfortable with our politicians being willing to operate on the lower end of that spectrum. And we can say that it's protected speech. So it's lawful. You're allowed to do it. My question is, should we? And I think that's an important thing as a Christian. We should be able to parse apart. Just because you're allowed to do something does not mean it's beneficial for you or the body politic. Does not mean it's actually loving your neighbor. I think we're called to a much higher standard of the should we is this how I love my neighbor? Not, well, the Constitution allows me to. And for Christians in particular, I am nervous that we have just bottom lined like, well, if the Constitution allows me to do it, it must be okay, as opposed to the higher call that Jesus offered us, which is to love our neighbor, which means anything on that lower end of the spectrum should be off limits. We should never bully. We should never intimidate. We should never threaten or harass. That should not be at all how we deal with our conflicts. And yet, my concern is even in the wake of mourning Charlie Kirk's passing, we do have people not only with prominence and influence, but with power actively intimidating, actively harassing other parts of our society. And that is not okay. And I don't see many voices in the church calling that out. I see the other side. We keep doing, one side is really good at pointing out the other side's sins and vice versa. But where is the voice of the church saying, gosh, we could do this better. We don't have to treat each other within this automatic ostracization, us, them, the other side is evil, the other side is out to get us. A lot of the memorial on Sunday, it felt like some of the voices that were speaking spent our entire time not memorializing Mr. Kirk, but talking about how evil the other side was. And I don't see that as a path forward for healing. I see that as pushing us farther apart.
Elizabeth, I really like how you're talking about these other freedoms, right? Not just freedom from violence, which is probably what law enforcement most cares about, but like you said, there are other freedoms, other rights like the freedom of speech that all of us, especially Christians, should be vested in, because like with the freedom of speech, like that's what enables us to share the gospel. I think another one is the freedom of association, which is sort of always emphasized in constitutional rights. But the freedom of association is the right of people to be together and organize around certain viewpoints. And to me, what was very troubling was that the Kirk assassination was used as a potential justification for going after the freedom of association of the organizations on the left and so forth. Can you speak to that? Like how conceivably and how plausible is it that the government could actually use the sort of governmental security apparatus to persecute and hound organizations of a liberal persuasion?
I mean, we're already seeing this administration do that. They've been doing it since really the spring, when they've threatened our universities, they've threatened nonprofit groups, foundations, and it's all kind of done carefully. I would put it in the category of intimidation. And we just saw last week the FCC commissioner say, like, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, right? Like that's kind of like the way that they've been approaching this, somewhat a wink and a nod to, well, I actually don't have the power, or I shouldn't have the power to do this thing, but if I suggest that I might, maybe they'll comply in advance. And we've seen a number of organizations, associations kind of just cave instead of saying, no, take me to court because you're not allowed to do that. And that's where, like, the few places where people are standing up and saying, no, you got to take me to court if you want me to comply with this. They usually win in court because the government doesn't actually have the authorities that they're asserting. The problem is that we have too many organizations that aren't standing up to them. And so you are seeing a number of examples where nonprofits and foundations and media organizations are basically just kind of giving up their First Amendment rights, just to hopefully the government will move on to another target. That it's really, really concerning. And I do think, as it pertains to Antifa, which the president signed an executive order related to, it's questionable how they're planning on using that executive order. It doesn't follow any of the law that exists for terrorist designations. So on one hand, they don't have any actual authorities to use the tools that we use when we're going after ISIS. However, they have demonstrated that they kind of just make up stuff. And then it's a bit like take me to court. And then the courts might knock it down. Then they'll go back to their toolkit and make up something else. So are they going to go find an organization or a group of people and say, you are Antifa, and therefore we are charging you with material support for terrorism? I don't see how any court doesn't laugh them out of the courtroom, because it's so preposterous if you understand this section of the law. But in the meantime, those people or that organization had to hire a lawyer. They had to stop focusing on what they were focusing on, and might be a whole lot more cautious in general to speaking out, because they don't want to have to deal with that legal pursuit. So the intimidation leads to chilling speech. And so even if they never cross the line and bring a charge, what they have done right now is made a whole lot of people hesitate about whether or not they're going to speak up against whatever cause, because they might be on the receiving end of a Department of Justice inquiry or the FBI knocking at their door.
Yeah, that is really disturbing, because, you look at across the world and the history of, when countries slide into totalitarian regimes, it seems to me like there's a consistent pattern, which is the, ruling government classifies all opposition as terrorists, and, then just chills sort of all activity. And then everybody is sort of tempted to do an advanced capitulation, precisely along the lines you said. I want to talk about other ways in which the government is responding or not responding to it, which is which data and which sort of pictures of reality are they paying attention to or not? You read about sort of the hiding or the suppressing of reports on where violence is coming from. What are you seeing in that regard?
So there's one thing that it's funny. They defunded most of the organizations and most of the studies that were ongoing to track the data around domestic terrorism. And the domestic terrorism categories go across the ideological spectrum. So the groups that they defunded hypothetically would be tracking what they might term left-wing violence as much as right-wing violence. But all of that got defunded as part of the DOJ efforts. So any place they might look to tell them, like, hey, has there been an uptick in violence? None of them are doing that work anymore. There are organizations that are maybe independently funded, not funded by government, who are still looking at data. And there is, and in my field, we've been talking about the fact that there is kind of an interesting shift on the left, both in the discussions of the types of violence that they're willing to commit. And historically, left-wing violence is focused on attacks on property, disruption of infrastructure. It is not premeditated and focused on attacking individuals. We are seeing some shifts. We, especially around the election time period, there were a number of groups that were talking about maybe they needed to take up arms, or maybe they needed to purchase arms to protect themselves. They were worried that the government might come to round them up. So that is a very big shift, because if you know anything about the far left, they're maybe the types of people that would want to ban guns from the country. So the idea that they are talking about maybe I need to protect myself and my family is a really big mindset shift on the far left. Nevertheless, though there have been an increase in attacks that you could categorize as far left compared to, say, the previous 30 years, it is still really, really low compared to what we see from the far right. But as somebody in my field, we find it fascinating, right? Like this is, and also not good, fascinating in a bad way, that all of a sudden We are starting to see increases from the far left when they've been pretty quiet for 30, 40 years. The last time we really saw the far left activated was in the 1960s and the 1970s.
Yeah.
None of us want to go back to that. So it is a little bit concerning that we might be setting ourselves up for some sort of repeat of that time period. All of that to say, that I don't know where the government is getting its data. They usually rely on these research groups that they fund, or they rely on FBI case data. And the FBI has shifted, they've actually moved a lot of their personnel to focus on immigration and cartels. And so they don't have as many people available to run cases on domestic terrorism. So if you were to compare this year's case data to last year's case data, there's going to be way more domestic terrorism cases last year than this year, just because they moved personnel to focus on some other issue areas. So even that is not a good statistic. The other statistic that they collect is hate crimes data, which is fraught with a whole host of challenges and how it gets collected. And it's not it's one data set that is useful, but it shouldn't be your only data set that you use. And in talking to people who work on that data, there is concern as to whether you're going to hear the full story. There's also concern that since that data comes from local communities might just stop reporting it. I'm not sure we're going to have good data from the government for quite some time.
All right, Elizabeth, as is true of a lot of conversations I have these days, it's like, wow, that's like a drumbeat of things that feel dark and hard. And let's face it, we are living in some hard times. But I'm going to ask you the question that I try to ask, maybe not every time, but I do ask consistently, which is, okay, as followers of Jesus, what are we hopeful for? What do we pin our hopes on? What do we pin our energies on? Answer that both as a security show and also as a Christian. Like, what does this moment call for?
I think one of the things I love about the community you've created, Curtis, is that it demonstrates, one, that there are people out there that are trying to do the right thing and that are trying to carry one another through, even if we're smaller in number than we thought that we were. I think I am taking and I'm making an effort to read about the communities that have gone before us who have worked in spaces that have been antagonistic to the faith. And so, stories of martyrs, stories of other parts of the church and other parts of the world, and how they thrive in the middle of the challenge. And I think for me, changing my mindset from one of, being a Christian is a part of majority dominant society, to the way that I practice my faith and the way that I am focusing on how do I love my neighbor, and that might not be a shared value in other parts of the church. So maybe the way that I need to practice my faith looks different than how the American church is currently practicing it, and I'm going to go find fellow believers who are also feeling called by the Spirit to practice the Beatitudes and to practice loving our neighbor. It can feel very lonely when we're watching some of the scenes that we saw over the weekend, this very patriotic Christianity, the cross wrapped in the flag. And it's a lot of, I don't know, Curtis, it's hard to sort through the feelings of being very, very upset that somebody died for speaking on a college campus. That is just utterly wrong and broken. And also discomforted by the way that the church is responding in such a way that makes Christianity just about America. I have a feeling that every single person that gets to listen to this podcast, God has called you to do something. And if we all just focus on the thing that God has called us to do and we're faithful in that calling, that's where the change will happen. God has this. The Spirit is at work. and we don't fully see it. And we're used to, in our Western mindset, having big plans and big strategies and how we're going to get from A to Z. And like God's already got it figured out. So if we are just responsible with the people he's placed in our lives and loving them well and doing that next right thing in our, where God has placed us, that faithfulness will reap fruit.
Well, Elizabeth, I can't put that any better than you just did. And so thank you. Thank you for combining your spiritual maturity and faithfulness with your expertise and security. It's such a unusual and in these days, a much needed combination. So thank you for sharing that with our listeners, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Curtis. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
And listeners, all of you who, like Elizabeth said, feel homeless and alone, hopefully this is our place that we gather together around the campfire.